In June of 2021, on the waters the Ho-Chunk Nation calls Wonk-Shikomik, Lake Mendota, Wisconsin, a maritime archaeologist named Tamara Thompson was diving alone, chasing fish and hauling trash off the lake bed. 24 feet down, she saw a shape rising out of the sand, a canoe, carved by hand more than 1,000 years earlier. It should have rotted away centuries ago. It hadn't. How does hand-carved wood survive 1,000 years underwater? Why was it left there in the first place? And why, 16 canoes later, does the explanation still not add up? This was not one lost boat. It was a fleet, deliberately placed, carefully chosen, left behind across thousands of years by people whose descendants still live beside this water, and no one has ever fully explained why so many were gathered here, or why it took 2 centuries before a single one was noticed. What follows weighs radiocarbon dates against laboratory survey records and Ho-Chunk oral tradition against the physical evidence pulled from the mud to ask what this lake was really being used for. Madison, Wisconsin sits on an isthmus between 2 of its 4 lakes, and Lake Mendota has long been treated mostly as scenery. The state capital looks out over it. Archaeologists catalogue something else nearby: earthen mounds shaped like birds and water spirits, built on the bluffs above the water by the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk. Almost no one thought to look under the water those mounds overlooked. Generations of swimmers and divers have used Mendota for over a century. Visibility is poor most of the year, and a half-buried log looks, to almost everyone, like exactly that. Once Thompson's find was dated to roughly 1,200 years old, the search widened. More canoes turned up, then more. As researchers sampled the wood, something did not fit. Nearly half the canoes were carved from red and white oak, a wood that absorbs water so readily that boatbuilders historically have tended to avoid it. A canoe made from ordinary red oak should have become waterlogged and sunk long before it ever carried a passenger. These hadn't. Something about the wood itself was wrong, and for a while nobody could say why. The simplest explanation was a coincidence of local timber. Wisconsin's shoreline forests are heavy with oak, and any dugout maker working near Mendota would have reached for what grew closest. That explanation held for a while. Then the mapping began. Researchers plotted every recovered canoe against the shoreline and found that they weren't scattered randomly across the lake bed at all. They clustered tightly in 2 distinct locations, both sitting directly below gaps in the bluffs where old drainage channels once cut down toward the water. Those bluffs rise roughly 35 feet above the lake, and for most of their length, there is no other way down to the shore. The canoes weren't lost. They were left over and over at the only 2 doors into the water. That is where the ordinary explanation stops working. A scattering of abandoned boats is an accident. A repeated pattern at the same 2 access points, spanning wood that dates from 2,000 years old to more than 5,000, is not an accident. It is a system used by many different generations of people who somehow kept arriving at the exact same place. And if that is true, the question stops being how a single canoe survived the water. It becomes how many hundreds or thousands of people managed to agree without writing anything down on exactly where a canoe belonged. The scale of what researchers were looking at kept growing with every dive season. By 2025, the count stood at 16 canoes, recovered and catalogued over roughly 4 years of survey work led by Thompson in partnership with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Wisconsin's First Nations. A second canoe dated to roughly 3,000 years old. A third came in at 4,500, a fourth at 2,000. And the oldest of all, when the lab results finally came back, was found to be close to 5,200 years old, carved, if the dating holds, before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built in Egypt, and around the same era writing was first being developed in Sumer. A single stretch of shoreline in the American Midwest had been producing evidence of continuous use for longer than most of recorded human civilization. Locating each one required side-scan sonar sweeps of the lake bed, followed by careful low-visibility dives to confirm what the sonar had flagged, season after season, in water cold enough to limit how long any diver could reasonably stay down. Thompson and her colleagues came to describe the pattern with a distinctly modern comparison. a ride-share network. Rather than being owned by a single family or individual, researchers believe each canoe likely belonged to the wider community, stashed at a shared location so that a traveler moving between the lake and the trail network above could simply take one, use it, and leave it behind for the next person. To keep the wood from cracking apart during Wisconsin's freezing winters, the canoes appear to have been deliberately sunk and buried in sediment, submerged at chest-to-waist depth, where the surrounding mud and cold water protected them until they were needed again. It is, as Thompson has described it, a parking spot that was used for thousands of years, over and over, by people who never left a written record of the arrangement, only the boats themselves. Inside one recovered vessel, archaeologists found stone net sinkers, flattened by hand and still resting where they had been left, as though a fishing trip had simply been paused rather than abandoned. And when the very first canoe, the 1,200-year-old one Thompson had spotted in 2021, was finally lifted into a conservation tank, it did something no one on the recovery team had fully expected. It floated. After more than a millennium underwater, the balance a long-dead builder had carved into that hull was still, quietly, correct. The wood question did not disappear, it deepened. Laboratory analysis on the water-absorbing red and white oak canoes revealed that many of the selected trees had developed tyloses, small, balloon-like cellular structures that can form inside a tree's wood and block water from moving through it. Ordinarily, tyloses appear in a tree that has already been wounded or stressed by disease or weather. Researchers now believe the canoe builders may have been deliberately choosing trees that already carried this damage, or in some cases wounding living trees on purpose to trigger the response before cutting them down. If that theory holds, it means indigenous boat builders working in this region were manipulating tree biology to solve a material science problem thousands of years before the word bioengineering existed. Some of the researchers studying these wood samples have said, plainly, that they are still not certain they fully understand the selection process being used, which raises an uncomfortable question for a modern audience accustomed to assuming technical knowledge only accumulates forward. Whatever this specific expertise was, it appears to have been lost, and rediscovering even pieces of it in a laboratory in the 21st century has proven harder than expected. Modern boat builders reach for cedar or birch specifically to avoid the problem red oak creates. Yet here, across at least 8 recovered canoes, that supposedly wrong material kept turning up and kept working. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, a body of knowledge built and tested over generations without instruments or written formulas, still capable of quietly outperforming the assumptions of people holding graduate degrees in materials science. There is a detail sitting directly above this evidence that has drawn quiet attention from researchers without yet being resolved. The same bluffs that funnel down toward both canoe clusters are crowned with effigy mounds, earthen shapes of birds, panthers, and water spirits, built by the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk. Madison's lakes once held more than 1,000 of these mounds, one of the densest concentrations of sacred earthworks found anywhere in the world. Whether the mound builders and the canoe builders were the same communities working across the same centuries, or whether the overlap is simply geographic, is not something the current evidence can settle. But the coincidence, if it is one, is difficult to ignore. The only 2 physical doorways down to this particular stretch of water were also marked, on the ridge directly above them, as something worth building a monument to. One researcher who has spent decades studying these earthworks has described them not as static markers but as constructions meant to feel alive, deliberately built to bind the natural world to something beyond it. If that description is accurate even in part, then the canoes resting in the mud below were not simply parked at a convenient boat launch. They were left at the base of ground the builders had already gone to enormous effort to treat as sacred. The formal record of this discovery is unusually recent and unusually well documented because, unlike most stories in this genre, it was not buried inside some forgotten 19th century survey report. It was built in real time under close observation. Thompson's first find in June of 2021 was made off the clock as a private citizen swimming for recreation rather than conducting a formal survey. What followed was years of methodical, funded fieldwork, partnership with University of Wisconsin-Madison researcher Cecil Schroeder, wood type analysis performed at the USDA Forest Products Laboratory, and radiocarbon dating carried out on samples no larger than a fingernail, each one split in two so that both tests could run independently. On a Wednesday in 2025, the Wisconsin Historical Society formally announced the full count: 16 canoes spanning roughly 5,200 years of use, mapped and dated through a process that took the better part of 4 years to complete. The announcement reframed how the institution itself talks about the region's deep past, treating this stretch of shoreline less as a footnote to Wisconsin history and more as one of its central chapters. 2 of the recovered canoes are now undergoing freeze-drying conservation at a facility in Texas, a slow process that removes the water still locked in their cellular structure without letting the wood collapse in on itself, expected to return for permanent display when Wisconsin's new History Center opens. None of this was news to the Ho-Chunk Nation, the indigenous people whose ancestral homeland surrounds all 4 of Madison's lakes. Ho-Chunk oral tradition describes ancestors living and traveling on these waters since before 2 ice ages, a time frame oral historians have maintained across generations, long before radiocarbon dating existed to test it. The lake itself carries a name in the Ho-Chunk language, Wonkshikomik, meaning where the man lies, tied to a creation story about the formation of the 4 lakes themselves. And the water carries its own guardian in that same tradition, a spirit called Wak Texi, said to live beneath Mendota's surface and to overturn the canoes of those who ventured too carelessly onto the water. In the broader Ho-Chunk creation account, the effigy mounds themselves are described as medicine placed into the earth by the Creator, rising up to remind the people who they are and where they come from, meant to remain, generation after generation, as a kind of permanent instruction. Set beside that belief, a guardian spirit watching the water below those same mounds is not a stray folktale. It is part of the same worldview, describing the same landscape, from the same source. Whether the Wak-Tixi story functioned purely as spiritual belief or also as an inherited caution about specific stretches of the lake is something outside researchers are careful not to claim to know. What is documented is that in September of 2022, former Ho-Chunk Nation President Marlon White Eagle personally thanked Thompson for the recovery work, and that every decision since about whether a canoe is raised, how it is preserved, and how it is displayed has been made in partnership with Ho-Chunk leadership, not around them. That collaboration extends to the new History Center itself, where Ho-Chunk voices are being asked to help decide not just how the canoes are shown, but how the story of who used them and why gets told at all. That partnership carries weight the physical evidence alone cannot explain. The Ho-Chunk were forcibly removed from this exact land in the decades following the 1832 Black Hawk War, ceding De Hope, their name for the 4 Lakes region, under pressure from encroaching settlement. That removal was not a single event. Over the following 4 decades, the federal government expelled Ho-Chunk families from Wisconsin again and again, marching many of them to Iowa, then Minnesota, then South Dakota, then Nebraska, and again a significant number walked hundreds of miles back to the only home their oral tradition described, arriving as refugees on land that no longer legally recognized them as residents. Some of those studying the gap between ancient use and modern discovery have raised a harder question, whether 2 centuries of displacement, broken treaties, and disrupted access to ancestral land may have interrupted exactly the kind of continuous, spoken-down knowledge that would have pointed researchers to these 2 shoreline gullies far sooner. Others point to the Wak-Tixi tradition itself and ask whether a lake already understood as home to something that overturns canoes may have quietly discouraged the kind of casual, curious swimming that eventually led to Thompson's discovery. Neither theory is proven, and both remain the subject of ongoing conversation between researchers and the Ho-Chunk community itself. What can be said is that a body of water sitting in the shadow of a state capital, surrounded by a major university, swum in by generations of residents, kept 16 boats and thousands of years of continuous use completely hidden until 2021. So was this stretch of shoreline simply a convenient parking spot for boats? Or was it something closer to a shrine, watched over by earthen effigies on the ridge above, and a water spirit said to guard the surface itself? And if generations of Ho-Chunk families carried the memory of exactly where to look, why did it take a stranger on an ordinary afternoon chasing fish with a flashlight to finally find it? Was the finding itself an accident, or was it, in some quieter sense, permitted? History, in a place like this, does not arrive as a single clean answer. It arrives in fragments, a fingernail-sized sliver of red oak, a name in a language older than the state that now surrounds the lake, a shape on a hillside that has outlasted by 1,000 years the people who first built it and the people who still remember why. Every one of those fragments points towards something larger than a boat, whether that something is a transportation system, a spiritual landscape, a chain of memory unbroken since before written history, or some combination none of these categories fully captures, remains genuinely unresolved. That may be the most honest thing this story can offer, a body of water that has been sitting in plain sight for as long as this region has had a name, still capable, after 5,000 years, of surprising the people who thought they already knew it. It is worth remembering that nothing about this discovery required new land to be broken open, or a temple uncovered beneath a jungle canopy. It required only a closer look at a lake thousands of people pass every day, a trained eye willing to stop and question an ordinary shape in the sand, and a willingness to ask what an entire community, working across an unbroken span of time, actually meant by leaving a boat exactly where it was found. Thank you for spending this time with us. If stories like this one, where physical evidence and indigenous memory are placed side by side rather than treated as competing accounts, are the kind of history you want more of, this channel exists to keep finding them, so consider subscribing for what comes next. And if you had grown up on the shore of a lake like Mendota, walked past mounds shaped like birds and panthers without knowing what lay beneath the water below them, would you have looked twice? We may never fully know what else this lake, or the ones like it, are still keeping. I'll see you in the next documentary.